The Hartwell mansion had been rotting from the inside for decades, though Michael Hartwell refused to acknowledge the decay. He stood in the grand foyer, its marble floors cracked like spider webs, watching dust motes dance in the filtered sunlight that struggled through grimy windows. The chandelier above him swayed with phantom breezes, its crystals singing a discordant lullaby that had haunted his dreams since childhood. Michael pressed his fingers against his temples, feeling the familiar throb that had intensified over the past months. The headaches came more frequently now, accompanied by a creeping certainty that something fundamental had shifted in his carefully ordered world. He could feel eyes watching him from the shadows of doorways, whispers following him through corridors that had once felt like sanctuary. The mansion stretched around him like a monument to faded grandeur, 47 rooms of memories he couldn't quite grasp, filled with furniture draped in white sheets that resembled ghosts in his peripheral vision. His grandmother's portrait dominated the main staircase, her painted eyes seeming to track his movements with disapproval that reached beyond the grave. Michael had inherited this place 3 years ago, along with the Hartwell name and all its burdens. The family fortune had dwindled to almost nothing, forcing him to take work wherever he could find it. The irony wasn't lost on him, a Hartwell reduced to serving others in Manhattan restaurants, when generations of his ancestors had commanded respect through wealth and influence. But lately, even the menial jobs felt contaminated by something he couldn't identify. Faces in Carlino's, the upscale Italian restaurant where he worked as a waiter, seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. Conversation stopped abruptly when he approached tables. The manager's instructions carried undertones that suggested knowledge Michael didn't possess about his own life. The mansion's silence pressed against his eardrums as he climbed the stairs to his bedroom, each step creaking a different note in a melody that spelled out warnings he couldn't decipher. His reflection in the hallway mirrors appeared fractured, as if the glass itself rejected his image. Sometimes he caught glimpses of movement in rooms he knew were empty, shadows that shouldn't exist in the afternoon light. Michael paused at his bedroom door, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the brass handle. The metal felt ice-cold despite the warm spring afternoon, and for a moment he could swear he heard his name being whispered from somewhere deep within the house's bowels. The lunch rush at Carlino's should have been routine. Michael had worked there for 8 months, long enough to recognize the patterns of Manhattan's financial district elite who frequented the establishment. They arrived in press suits and designer heels, speaking in abbreviated sentences about mergers and acquisitions while barely acknowledging the staff who catered to their every whim. Michael moved between tables with practiced efficiency, his movements precise despite the growing disorientation that had plagued him for weeks. The restaurant's atmosphere felt different today, the air thicker, conversations muted as if heard through water. Even the familiar clatter of dishes from the kitchen sounded distorted, like echoes from a great distance. He was refilling water glasses at table 12 when he first noticed her. She sat hunched in the corner booth, her clothes layers of mismatched fabric that had seen better decades. Her gray hair hung in unwashed tangles around a face mapped with lines that spoke of hardship and exposure to elements. She clutched a worn canvas bag to her chest as if it contained her entire world. The sight of her triggered something visceral in Michael's chest, a mixture of disgust and fear that surprised him with its intensity. She didn't belong here among the marble surfaces and crystal stemware. Her presence felt like contamination, a breach in the carefully maintained barrier between his world and the chaos that lurked outside. Michael approached the hostess station where Sophia Martinez was reviewing the reservation book. Sophia had worked at Carlino's for 3 years, her efficiency and professionalism earning her the respect of both management and staff. Today, however, her usual composure seemed strained, her dark eyes darting nervously between Michael and the woman in the corner booth. "She just walked in," Sophia murmured without looking up from her book. "Said she wanted a table. I tried to explain that we require reservations, but she just sat down." Michael glanced back at the woman, who was now studying the menu with intense concentration. Her fingers traced the words as if she were reading Braille, and occasionally she would look up and scan the restaurant with eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "I'll handle it," Michael said, though his voice sounded strange to his own ears. The walk across the dining room felt interminable. Other patrons seemed to fade into the background, their conversations becoming unintelligible murmurs. The woman looked up as he approached, and Michael was struck by the clarity of her gaze. It held none of the confusion or desperation he expected from someone in her circumstances. "Ma'am, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," Michael began, his voice carrying the practiced politeness that masked his revulsion. "This is a reservation-only establishment. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The woman studied him for a long moment, her head tilted slightly as if she were listening to something he couldn't hear. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but carried an odd authority. I see. And you make these decisions based on what criteria, exactly? The question caught Michael off guard. He had expected protestation, perhaps tears or anger, not this calm inquiry that seemed to strip away his carefully constructed professional facade. It's restaurant policy, he replied, but the words felt hollow. We cater to a specific clientele. Ah, yes, a specific clientele. She nodded slowly, then reached into her canvas bag with deliberate movements. And I suppose I don't qualify. What she withdrew from the bag made Michael's vision blur momentarily. It was a credit card, but unlike any he had ever seen. The material appeared to be some kind of black metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. No visible numbers or text marked its surface, yet it radiated an unmistakable sense of significance. Perhaps this changes your assessment, she said, placing the card on the white tablecloth with a soft click that seemed to reverberate through the restaurant. Michael stared at the card, his rational mind trying to process what he was seeing while something deeper recognized its importance. The black surface seemed to shift and move when he wasn't looking directly at it, patterns emerging and dissolving like smoke on water. I don't understand, he whispered, though he was beginning to suspect that his understanding was precisely what was being called into question. The woman smiled then, and in that expression Michael saw something that made his blood freeze. It wasn't kindness or triumph, it was recognition, as if she had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. No, she said softly. I don't suppose you do. The restaurant around them seemed to hold its breath. Michael could feel the weight of stares from other diners, though when he glanced around, everyone appeared to be absorbed in their own conversations. Sophia stood frozen at the hostess station, her hand suspended over the reservation book as if time itself had stuttered. Michael's fingers hovered over the black card, not quite touching its surface. The metal radiated cold that he could feel even at a distance, and somewhere in the back of his mind, alarms were sounding that he couldn't quite hear. Who are you? He asked, though he wasn't entirely sure he wanted the answer. The better question, the woman replied, is who you think you are. The rest of Michael's shift passed in a haze of routine motions performed by muscle memory while his mind churned over the encounter. The woman, she had given her name as Diana Walsh when he finally, reluctantly, seated her, had ordered the most expensive items on the menu with casual confidence. The black card had processed without issue, though the receipt that printed was blank except for a confirmation number that consisted entirely of zeros. Michael found himself stealing glances at her table throughout the afternoon, searching for some explanation that would restore his sense of normalcy. Diana ate slowly, savoring each bite as if she hadn't tasted food in months, yet there was nothing desperate or grateful in her manner. She carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone accustomed to being served, not someone grateful for unexpected charity. When she finally left, she paused at his station and placed a $20 tip on his tray, a standard amount that somehow felt more significant than the mysterious card transaction. Thank you for the service, Michael, she said, and the way she pronounced his name sent shivers down his spine. I'm sure we'll be seeing each other again soon. She was gone before he could ask how she knew his name, leaving behind only the faint scent of jasmine and something else, something that reminded him of the dust and silence of the Hartwell mansion. The subway ride home to the family property felt different that evening. Michael had taken the same route hundreds of times, but tonight the familiar station seemed to stretch longer, the darkness between them more complete. His reflection in the train windows appeared distorted, features shifting subtly when he wasn't paying attention. Other passengers avoided eye contact, their faces blurring together into an indistinguishable mass of humanity that felt suddenly foreign and threatening. The mansion loomed against the darkening sky as his taxi pulled up the long drive. Michael had always found the approach imposing, but tonight it felt actively malevolent, as if the building itself was aware of his return and disapproved. Windows that should have been dark gleamed with faint light, though Michael knew he had left no lamps burning. Inside, the silence felt different, expectant rather than empty. Michael's footsteps echoed with unusual resonance, as if the house had grown larger in his absence. He made his way to the kitchen, seeking the comfort of routine, but even that familiar space felt alien. Shadows pooled in corners where they had never gathered before, and the refrigerator's hum carried undertones that sounded almost like whispered conversations. Michael poured himself a glass of wine from a bottle he had been saving for no particular occasion, then settled into his father's old armchair in the study. The leather was cracked and worn, but it had always been a place of comfort. Tonight, however, it felt like sitting in the embrace of something that might not have his best interest at heart. The wine tasted off, not spoiled, but somehow wrong, as if it had been intended for someone else's palate. Michael set the glass aside and tried to focus on the day's events, to find some rational explanation for the growing sense that his life was spiraling beyond his control. Diana Walsh had been real. He could still see her clearly in his mind, still feel the weight of her gaze as she studied him across that restaurant table. The black card had been real too, though what it represented remained a mystery. But it was more than these tangible elements that disturbed him. It was the growing certainty that everyone around him knew something he didn't, that conversations were taking place just beyond his ability to hear them. Michael walked to the study's tall windows and looked out over the mansion grounds. The moonlight transformed the familiar landscape into something subtly wrong. Shadows fell at impossible angles, and trees seemed to lean inward as if listening to secrets whispered by the wind. In the distance, he could swear he saw lights moving through the woods, though no roads ran in that direction. He turned back to the room and froze. His father's portrait, which had hung above the mantelpiece for as long as Michael could remember, was empty. The ornate frame remained in place, but the canvas within showed only a void so complete it seemed to draw light into itself. Michael rubbed his eyes, certain he was hallucinating, but when he looked again, the portrait remained empty. He approached it slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. Up close, he could see that the canvas wasn't actually blank. There were subtle variations in the darkness, patterns that suggested shapes just beyond perception. As he stared, the void seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Gradually, an image began to emerge from the darkness, not his father's familiar features, but his own face, distorted and multiplied as if seen through a funhouse mirror. Each reflection showed him from a different angle, different age, different expression, but all carrying the same look of dawning horror. Michael stumbled backward, his vision blurring with panic. The wine glass shattered as his elbow caught it, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. As he knelt to clean up the shards, his fingers found something that shouldn't have been there, a business card, black as midnight, with text that seemed to write itself as he watched. Diana Walsh, Senior Director, Reality Verification Department. Below the text was an address in Manhattan, but it wasn't for any building Michael recognized. The street number was impossibly high, and the street name was one he had never heard despite living in New York his entire life. Michael's hand shook as he turned the card over. On the back, in elegant script that seemed to shimmer with its own light, were two words that made his blood run cold. Final review. Michael didn't sleep that night. He sat in the study watching his father's portrait, which had returned to normal sometime after midnight, the familiar stern features once again gazing down with patrician disapproval. The business card remained on the side table where he had placed it, its black surface reflecting the lamplight in ways that defied optical logic. By morning, Michael had almost convinced himself that exhaustion and stress had caused the previous night's hallucinations. The wine had been stronger than he remembered, and the encounter with Diana Walsh had clearly affected him more than he cared to admit. People in his situation, the slow decline of family fortune, the pressure of maintaining appearances while working service jobs, often experienced psychological symptoms. It was perfectly rational, perfectly explainable. This fragile rationalization shattered the moment he arrived at Carlino's for his afternoon shift. Sophia greeted him at the staff entrance with an expression of barely contained anxiety. Her usual professional demeanor had been replaced by something that looked suspiciously like pity, and she kept glancing toward the dining room as if expecting something unpleasant to emerge from it. "Michael, I need to talk to you before you start," she said, her voice carrying a tremor he had never heard before. They stepped into the small office behind the kitchen, where manager David Castellano sat reviewing what appeared to be personnel files. David was a compact man in his 50s who had worked in Manhattan restaurants for most of his adult life. He possessed the kind of professional composure that came from dealing with demanding clientele and high-pressure service, but today his hands shook slightly as he turned pages. "Sit down, Michael," David said without looking up. "We need to discuss yesterday's incident." Michael settled into the uncomfortable chair across from the desk, his mind racing through possible explanations for what he was beginning to realize might be disciplinary action. "If this is about the woman in the corner booth, I handled the situation appropriately. She had a valid payment method, and—" "That's just it," David interrupted, finally meeting his eyes. "We ran the transaction through our system 3 times last night. The card number doesn't exist in any database we can access. The bank has no record of the account. The credit card company has never issued a card with that number." Michael felt the familiar tightness in his chest that had been building for weeks. "That's impossible." I processed the payment myself. It went through without any problems. Sophia stepped forward, her expression mixing concern with something that might have been fear. Michael, we need you to think carefully about what happened yesterday. The security cameras show you seating someone at table 9, but the footage is strange. The person you're interacting with appears differently from different camera angles. Sometimes clearly visible, sometimes not there at all. The room seemed to tilt around Michael as the implications sank in. He gripped the arms of his chair, trying to maintain some connection to reality as it shifted beneath him like unstable ground. Are you suggesting I imagine the entire encounter? David and Sophia exchanged a look that confirmed Michael's growing suspicions about the nature of their conversation. This wasn't disciplinary action, it was an intervention. We're suggesting, David said carefully, that you might want to consider taking some time off. Maybe speak to someone about the stress you've been under lately. The other staff members have mentioned that you've seemed distracted recently. Michael's paranoia, which had been simmering just below the surface for months, suddenly boiled over. The careful expressions on their faces, the way they spoke in measured tones, the implication that his own perceptions couldn't be trusted, it all pointed to a conspiracy that was finally revealing itself. What aren't you telling me? He demanded, rising from his chair with more force than necessary. You know something about Diana Walsh, don't you? About the card. The silence that followed his outburst stretched uncomfortably long. Sophia's eyes filled with what looked like genuine sympathy, while David's expression hardened into the kind of professional mask that preceded difficult conversations. Michael, Sophia said softly, there was no Diana Walsh. The reservation system shows no record of that name. The table you seated her at was occupied by the Henderson party from 2 until 4. We have the credit card receipts. Michael pulled the black business card from his wallet with trembling fingers. Then explained this. He placed it on David's desk, expecting to see recognition or shock on their faces. Instead, both Sophia and David stared at the empty space where the card should have been, their expressions shifting from concern to alarm. Michael, David said slowly, you're not holding anything. Michael looked down at his hand, which was indeed empty, then at the desk surface where he had placed the card. Nothing was there except the scattered personnel files and David's coffee cup. But he could still feel the card's weight in his fingers, still see its impossible blackness absorbing the office's fluorescent light. I can see it, he whispered. It's right there. The look that passed between Sophia and David spoke volumes about conversations they had been having without him, assessments they had been making of his mental state. Michael realized with growing horror that he had become the subject of their concern, the problematic employee whose behavior required careful management. I think you should go home, David said with forced gentleness. Take a few days to rest. We'll hold your position until you're feeling better. Michael wanted to argue, to demand they acknowledge what was plainly visible on the desk between them, but some remaining shred of self-preservation warned him against pushing further. He was already balanced on the edge of something that looked suspiciously like a complete break from reality. Any additional pressure might send him tumbling into an abyss from which there would be no return. He picked up the invisible card and slipped it back into his wallet, ignoring the worried glances Sophia and David exchanged. Fine. I'll take some time off. As he left the restaurant, Michael caught his reflection in the front windows and froze. For just a moment, the person staring back at him was a stranger, older, more haggard, with eyes that held the kind of knowledge that came at too high a price. Then the image shifted back to his familiar features, leaving him to wonder if he had seen a glimpse of his future or a revelation about his present. The subway ride home felt like a journey through increasingly unstable dimensions. Each station brought him closer to the mansion and further from any connection to a reality others might recognize. By the time he emerged from the final stop, Michael was no longer certain whether he was traveling through physical space or through the geography of his own dissolution. The Hartwell mansion welcomed Michael home with an atmosphere of expectancy that had grown more pronounced during his absence. The afternoon light fell through windows at angles that seemed geometrically impossible, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. The familiar creak of floorboards under his feet had developed new rhythms, as if the house itself was speaking in a language he was only beginning to understand. Michael found Diana Walsh waiting in the drawing room. She sat in his grandmother's favorite chair, looking perfectly at ease despite having no apparent means of entry. Her previous raggedness had been replaced by clothing that was subtly elegant, the kind of understated sophistication that only came with real wealth. Her hair was clean and styled, her posture erect with unmistakable authority. "Hello, Michael," she said as he stood frozen in the doorway. "I hope you don't mind that I let myself in." We need to continue our conversation. The casual presumption of her presence should have triggered outrage or fear, but Michael found himself experiencing something closer to relief. Finally, someone who acknowledged the reality he was experiencing, who didn't look at empty spaces when he pointed to obvious truths. The restaurant staff couldn't see you, he said, settling into the chair across from her with surprising calm. They thought I was having a breakdown. Diana nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose expectations had been confirmed. That's perfectly normal at this stage. Reality becomes increasingly subjective as the assessment progresses. Most people experience some degree of isolation from their previous social contexts. Assessment, Michael repeated, tasting the word and finding it strangely familiar. You mentioned that before. What exactly are you assessing? Diana reached into a briefcase that definitely hadn't been there moments before and withdrew a thick folder bearing Michael's name in elegant calligraphy. The sight of it sent chills down his spine. He had never seen the folder before, yet it looked ancient, as if it had been accumulating information about him for decades. The Hartwell family has been under evaluation for some time, Diana said, opening the folder to reveal pages of documents, photographs, and charts that seemed to chronicle every aspect of his life. Your bloodline carries certain complications that require periodic review. Michael leaned forward to get a better look at the documents, but the text seemed to writhe on the pages, rearranging itself whenever he tried to focus on specific words. Photographs showed him at various ages, in locations he couldn't remember visiting, with people whose faces were familiar yet impossible to place. I don't understand what you're talking about, he said, though the statement felt less true with each passing moment. Diana turned a page, revealing what appeared to be a family tree that stretched back hundreds of years. The Hartwell name appeared repeatedly, but the dates associated with various family members didn't align with Michael's knowledge of his genealogy. Some ancestors appeared to have lived for impossibly long periods, while others seemed to exist in multiple time periods simultaneously. Your family has a unique relationship with reality, Diana explained with clinical detachment. Each generation produces individuals who exist partially outside conventional space-time. It's a valuable trait, but it requires careful monitoring to prevent complications. Complications, Michael echoed, the word carrying implications that terrified him more than the growing evidence of his own instability. Reality distortions. Temporal displacement. In extreme cases, complete dissociation from the consensus framework that most people inhabit. Diana's voice carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing routine administrative matters. Your case has been developing for several months. The paranoia, the visual hallucinations, the growing disconnect from your social environment, all perfectly predictable symptoms. Michael stood and walked to the window, needing to ground himself in the familiar view of the mansion grounds. But the landscape beyond the glass bore little resemblance to what he remembered. The woods had grown closer to the house, their branches reaching toward the windows with obvious intent. In the distance, structures that had never existed before dotted the horizon, towers and bridges that belonged to no architectural tradition he recognized. This isn't real, he whispered, though the words carried no conviction. Reality is a consensus, Diana replied. When enough people agree on the nature of existence, that agreement becomes the foundation for what we call the real world. But some individuals, people like you, have the ability to perceive alternative frameworks. The question is whether that ability can be managed or whether it will ultimately consume you. Michael turned back to face her, and for a moment her appearance shifted. Instead of the elegant professional, he saw something vast and inhuman wearing human features like an uncomfortable mask. The vision lasted only seconds, but it left him with the certainty that Diana Walsh was not what she appeared to be. What do you want from me? Diana smiled, and this time the expression was entirely human, warm, almost maternal. I want to help you understand your options. The assessment has reached its final phase. We need to determine whether you can function within the established reality framework or whether you've progressed beyond the point where integration is possible. She stood and walked to where Michael's father's portrait hung, studying the painted features with professional interest. Your father faced the same choice 30 years ago. He chose integration, medication, therapy, a carefully structured life that kept his perceptions within acceptable parameters. He died believing he had successfully overcome a mental illness. And the alternative? Diana turned back to him, and in her eyes Michael saw depths that stretched far beyond anything human consciousness should contain. You accept what you're becoming. Join us in the spaces between realities. Help us monitor others who are undergoing the same transformation. The offer hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Michael understood that his choice would determine not just his future, but his fundamental relationship with existence itself. "I need time to think," he said. "Of course," Diana replied, gathering her papers back into the briefcase. "But don't take too long. The assessment period is nearly complete, and reality has a way of making decisions for those who wait too long to make them themselves." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Michael? You might want to avoid the restaurant for a while. Your former colleagues are becoming concerned about your behavior. They've contacted some people who specialize in helping individuals who have difficulty distinguishing between what they perceive and what actually exists." The words sent ice through Michael's veins. What kind of people? But Diana was already gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of jasmine and the growing certainty that Michael's carefully constructed world was about to collapse entirely. The following days blurred together in a kaleidoscope of shifting realities that left Michael increasingly disconnected from any fixed point of reference. The mansion itself seemed to be transforming around him, rooms rearranging themselves when he wasn't looking, corridors leading to destinations that hadn't existed the day before. His reflection in mirrors showed different versions of himself, sometimes younger, sometimes older, occasionally wearing clothes he had never owned or displaying scars he had never received. Sleep became elusive, not because of insomnia, but because the distinction between waking and dreaming had begun to dissolve. Michael would find himself standing in the kitchen making coffee with no memory of getting out of bed, or he would wake up in the garden with dirt under his fingernails and the taste of earth in his mouth. Time moved in stutters and loops, afternoon shadows falling before morning light had fully established itself. The phone calls began on the third day. Sophia's voice carried the carefully modulated tone of someone who had been coached on how to speak to the mentally unstable. She was checking on him, she said, making sure he was eating properly, taking care of himself. The subtext was clear. She was monitoring his condition, reporting back to people who were making decisions about his welfare. "We're all worried about you, Michael," she said during one call. "Dr. Patterson thinks it would be good if you came in for a consultation, just to talk through some of the stress you've been experiencing." Michael gripped the phone tighter, his paranoia crystallizing around the implications of her words. "Dr. Patterson? I don't know any Dr. Patterson. She's a colleague of mine. Very understanding, very discreet. She's helped other people who have been through similar experiences." The lie was so transparent that Michael almost laughed. Sophia was feeding him information provided by others, playing a role in a drama whose script he wasn't allowed to read. The realization that his former colleagues were actively conspiring against him should have been devastating, but instead it brought a strange kind of relief. At least now he knew where he stood. "I appreciate the concern," he said, "but I'm fine. Just need some time to rest." After he hung up, Michael stood in the hallway listening to the house breathe around him. The walls expanded and contracted with a rhythm that almost matched his heartbeat, and occasionally he could hear voices murmuring in rooms that should have been empty. The voices were discussing him, he realized, analyzing his behavior, debating his prognosis, making recommendations about his treatment. That evening, Diana Walsh appeared in his study without warning or explanation. She materialized from the shadows near the fireplace, her form solidifying like smoke condensing into flesh. This time she made no attempt to maintain human appearance. Her features shifted constantly, showing glimpses of the vast intelligence that wore Diana's face as a convenience. "The assessment is complete," she announced, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Your integration scores have fallen below acceptable thresholds. Consensus reality can no longer accommodate your level of perceptual deviation." Michael had been expecting this moment, but hearing it confirmed still sent tremors through his chest. "And if I refuse to accept your alternative?" Diana's expression flickered between sympathy and something that might have been hunger. "Then reality will make the choice for you. Your former colleagues have already begun the process. Dr. Patterson is quite skilled at helping people like you disappear quietly." As if summoned by her words, Michael heard the sound of car doors closing in the mansion's front drive. Through the study windows, he could see headlights cutting through the darkness, figures moving with purpose toward the house. The cavalry had arrived, armed with sedatives and legal documents that would strip away his autonomy in the name of protecting him from himself. "They're coming to take me away," Michael said, surprised by how calm he felt. "Only if you let them." Diana stood and walked to the window, her form becoming more solid as the external threat approached. But you have options they don't understand. You've seen what lies beyond their narrow consensus. You know there are spaces where their authority doesn't reach. Michael could hear footsteps on the front porch now, voices discussing entry strategies in tones that mixed concern with professional efficiency. Soon they would be inside, surrounding him with gentle but implacable force, explaining how they were here to help while they destroyed any possibility of his maintaining independence. What exactly are you offering? Diana turned from the window, and in her eyes Michael saw infinite dimensions stretching away from the mundane reality that had become a prison. Freedom, purpose, the chance to help others who are undergoing the same transformation you've experienced. There are many like you, Michael, people whose perception extends beyond conventional boundaries. They need guides who understand what they're experiencing. The front door opened, and Michael heard Sophia's voice in the foyer, speaking with forced cheer about how worried everyone had been, how much better he would feel once he got the help he needed. Her words were punctuated by deeper voices discussing logistics, medication schedules, transportation arrangements. I accept, Michael said. Diana smiled, and the expression was simultaneously human and utterly alien. I hoped you would. The study around them began to dissolve, its solid walls becoming translucent, then transparent, then absent entirely. Michael found himself floating in a space that defied geometric description, surrounded by structures that existed in more dimensions than his mind could process. In the distance, he could see other figures, people like himself who had made the same choice, who served as bridges between realities for those still trapped in singular perception. Behind him, he heard Sophia's voice calling his name, heard footsteps climbing the stairs toward a study that no longer contained anything they could recognize or reach. Their reality would record that Michael Hartwell had simply vanished, leaving behind no trace except the growing legend of another troubled soul who had been unable to cope with the pressures of modern life. 6 months later, at a small cafe in Brooklyn's Williamsburg, a young woman named Jessica Chen stared across the table at her brother David with growing anxiety. David had been acting strangely for weeks, talking about people who weren't there, insisting that conversations were taking place that Jessica couldn't hear, becoming increasingly isolated from friends and family. You don't understand, David said, his voice carrying the desperate edge that had become familiar over the past month. They're watching me, making notes about everything I do. The woman at the coffee shop yesterday, she knew things about me that I've never told anyone. Jessica reached across the table and took her brother's hand, feeling the tremor that had developed recently. David, I think you need to talk to someone. A professional. This paranoia isn't healthy. David's eyes widened with the kind of fear that suggested Jessica had just confirmed his worst suspicions. You're part of it, aren't you? They sent you to evaluate me, to report back on my condition. No one sent me anywhere, Jessica said, though even as she spoke she wondered if her words carried the artificial quality that David seemed to detect in everyone's speech lately. I'm your sister. I love you. I'm worried about you. David pulled his hand away and stood abruptly, knocking over his coffee cup in the process. The dark liquid spread across the table like spilled ink, and for a moment Jessica could swear she saw patterns in the stain, symbols that seemed to shift and change when she wasn't looking directly at them. I have to go, David said, backing toward the cafe entrance. They're coming for me soon. I can feel it. He turned and rushed out onto the sidewalk, leaving Jessica to deal with the spilled coffee and the concerned stares of other patrons. As Jessica cleaned up the mess, she found herself wondering if her brother's paranoia might be more justified than she wanted to admit. There had been phone calls recently from people claiming to be old friends of David's, asking probing questions about his mental state. A woman had approached Jessica outside her apartment building, introducing herself as Dr. Walsh and offering her card in case Jessica needed someone to talk to about her brother's condition. Jessica looked out the cafe window and saw David standing on the corner, talking animatedly to someone who wasn't there. But as Jessica watched, she began to make out the faint outline of another figure, tall, elegantly dressed, with an air of authority that made Jessica's skin crawl with inexplicable dread. The figure seemed to notice Jessica's scrutiny and turned in her direction. For just a moment, their eyes met across the distance, and Jessica felt the weight of an intelligence that was vast, ancient, and utterly inhuman. Then David and his companion dissolved into the crowd, leaving Jessica with the growing certainty that her brother's delusions might be the most accurate perception of reality that anyone in their family had ever achieved. Later that evening, Jessica found a business card slipped under her apartment door. It was black as midnight, with text that seemed to write itself as she watched. Diana Walsh, Senior Director, Reality Verification Department. On the back, an elegant script that shimmered with its own light, were two words that made her blood run cold. Assessment pending. Jessica crumpled the card and threw it in the trash, then immediately retrieved it and smoothed out the wrinkles. She carried it to her bedroom and placed it on the nightstand, where it would catch the morning light and remind her that some invitations, no matter how terrifying, might be the only escape from a reality that was far more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. In the spaces between worlds, Michael Hartwell felt the familiar tingle that indicated a new case had been assigned to him. The sensation was like static electricity dancing across his consciousness, carrying with it impressions of another.